Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. My guest today is Dan Pink, a contributing editor at Wired and the author of Free Agent Nation, and most recently, A Whole New Mind. Dan, welcome to EconTalk.
Russ, it's great to be here.
Dan, your recent book, A Whole New Mind, argues that the right side of our brains is going to play an increasingly important role in the modern workplace. What do you mean by that? What do you have in mind?
Well, what I'm talking about is really using the structure of our brain as a metaphor for understanding the contours of business, and particularly the contours of labor markets today. And what I mean is this: our brains have two sides, the left hemisphere and right hemisphere. There's been a lot of really stupid stuff written about the right side of the brain and so forth over the years. But in the last several years, the science has in some ways caught up to the popularization. And what we now know is that our brains are very elegant, very efficient, and they've done this miraculous job of dividing up tasks. Left side specializes in tasks that are logical, linear, sequential, analytical. Right hemisphere specializes in tasks that are more about processing things simultaneously, more about understanding context rather than text, more about synthesis rather than analysis. And I think that metaphor explains a lot. And my argument is that the sorts of abilities that used to get people ahead in work were often characteristic of the left hemisphere, the logical, linear, sequential, analytical, spreadsheet, SAT kind of abilities. And today, those abilities are absolutely necessary, and that's, I think, actually really important to underscore. Those abilities are absolutely necessary, but they're not sufficient. And the abilities that now matter most are abilities that are characteristic of the right hemisphere: artistry, empathy, inventiveness, big-picture thinking. Those, in a whole host of interesting ways, are increasingly the abilities that are determining who moves forward and who falls behind.
So you're stressing necessary but not sufficient. So it's useful and important in the workplace to have the left side of the brain be productive and active.
I would even go further. I would say it's essential.
If you're going to do particularly well in America in 2007. But
you need those left brain abilities.
But you argue
if you
that
have those left brain abilities, you're not going to make it.
Now, why is that? What's the argument there?
Well, the argument is three forces, I think, are tilting the scales, and they're the three A's. And because I'm not an economist or a tenured professor, I have to alliterate. So they are.
Well, and three is a good number as well, right?
Well,
3,
I'm a Trinitarian.
7. You got 3, 7, or 10.
I believe that everything comes in threes. So the forces are abundance, Asia, and automation. And in brief, what I mean by that is this. On abundance, I mean the really staggering levels of material well-being deep into the middle class in the advanced economies, not only the United States, but Canada and Australia and Japan and Western Europe. And this is remarkable. This is, I think, one of the unheralded stories of our time, is just how incredibly well off in material terms regular middle-class people are. In some ways, the material well-being of the typical, let's say the median family in America, would in some fashion be unrecognizable to my grandparents. If my grandparents were to see the median family in, say, the Washington metropolitan area or anywhere in the U.S., let's say we were to put my grandparents when they were my age, in their 40s, transport them through time to 2007, and take them to the median family in Prince George's County, Maryland, they would think they're in the home of some of the richest people ever. They have cars, they've got. They go on vacations. They own their own home. They have an array of electronics. Their kids probably have a chance to go to college. And I think what this abundance has done is shaped business in two ways. First, it's put a premium on the aesthetic, emotional, even kind of sometimes even spiritual offering of goods and services and experiences in the marketplace. That is, people's needs for functionality and utility have been satisfied and oversatisfied, so the way that companies are trying to stand out in a crowded marketplace is through aesthetics, through look and feel, through some of these more right-brain attributes. This is why we have designer toilet brushes. This is why we have designer hearing aids. This is why why cell phones in some fashion have moved from a technological device to an aesthetic device. So that's one way that abundance is tilting the scales. The other way is that all of this abundance hasn't actually done a lot to boost subjective well-being. People have gotten richer, but not altogether that much happier, more satisfied. If you look at polling data, or particularly something called the World Values Survey out at the University of Michigan. And what that has done is, I think in some ways, democratized the search for meaning. That is, people have been liberated by prosperity, not fulfilled by it, and so they're using their extra time and treasure to do things that are meaningful, whether it's yoga or meditation or finding work that's meaningful. And I think this is also one of the great unheralded stories of our time. And Robert William Fogel of Chicago, Nobelist, has written about what he calls the Fourth Great Awakening. And I think he's really on about how prosperity has extended that search for meaning to a broader swath of the population than ever before. So anyway, at the risk of going on too long, that's how abundance tilts the scales to the right brain.
And we had
put the premium on the aesthetic, emotional aspects of goods and services, and then it democratizes the search for meaning.
And we had Greg Easterbrook on for a podcast a while back on this the abundance part of that.
Yes, exactly. Well,
and
no,
you
I
refer to Greg's work. Yeah, you do.
Right. No, I quote his book in my book.
Yeah.
Because I think he's spot on about a lot of that stuff. I don't necessarily agree with him on a lot of his policy solutions, but I think the analysis is absolutely spot on, and it's one of these points that just doesn't get too recognized in mainstream, especially media culture. Just how well off people are today materially, but also the fact that this increasing economic prosperity hasn't necessarily translated into corresponding amounts of subjective well-being.
But I like the point as well that the premium it puts on style and aesthetic and self-expression, the use of customization to try to remove the commodity aspect of some of the improvements, and I think it's a good insight.
Well, I think it's actually just a fact, a scary fact of life. If you go out and talk to people who are running businesses, who are coming up with new products and services, I mean, you get a sense that everyone is teetering on the abyss of commodity hell. That's what happens in a world of abundance, and the way to avoid toppling into that abyss, to pull back from the precipice, if you'll pardon the purplish metaphor, is to decommoditize through these more right-brain things, through the backstory of a product or a service, through design, through the emotional aspect of it, through outstanding customer service, or, of course, obviously, through dramatic leaps in utility. Not incremental leaps,
Correct.
but dramatic leaps in functionality, which is an act of invention, not an act of, engineering, tinkering.
Yeah, we're taping this in early June. I'm not sure when it'll air, but at the end of this month, the iPhone is scheduled to come out, and it purports to be certainly an aesthetic leap forward. Whether it is a functional leap forward remains to be seen, but if it's both, obviously it'll be an enormous home run. If it's, quote, only aesthetic, I think it'll still be very successful, but it will have to function well. That is the minimum standard.
Functionality gets you to the table. It is basically making a serious promise to customers, and that it is this dramatic leap in both aesthetics and functionality. But even if you look at cell phones, it's just really quite remarkable. I mean, I was in Japan last month, and it's last 2 months, and it's so clear to me, if you go to a place like Japan, which is a little bit ahead of us on mobile phones, that mobile phones have become essentially an accessory. It has become, in some ways, a component of fashion. You look at a mobile phone counter display in an electronics store in Japan, and it looks, and I should show you, I have these photographs. I mean, it's too bad there isn't a video part of this podcast.
We can put the pictures up on the web.
Counter. You take a photograph of a cosmetics counter and a photograph of a cell phone counter, and they look the same. because these cell phones have become essentially aesthetic devices.
Well, I think that's
there are all of these cell phone customizers in Japan who put decorations and rhinestones and all kinds of customized things on people's phones. There's a huge market in cell phone charms as people customize it with Hello Kitty or blackjack or manga characters. So it's just it has become in some ways a technological device that doubles as a fashion accessory, as a kind of jewelry, as a means of self-expression. It's just really quite remarkable. And I think, I want one of those iPhones too, because I hate my cell phone.
Yeah.
But again, you give me a cell phone that works, and it could be ugly, and I might still use it. But eventually, we're going to get to the point where cell phones more or less work reasonably well, and people are going to end up wanting to differentiate based on some of these more aesthetic, emotional things.
Well, competition among cell phone suppliers is going to ensure that you don't have to have an ugly one. The interesting point about Japanese culture, I have a feeling that among younger cell phone users here in the United States, that fashion part is very much alive and well. That's my guess.
And I think that it's right, and I think that it is. And I think that it's accelerating. And you see it again. You see it, and if you think about just the swiftness with which something like that has gone from essentially a technological device to an aesthetic device, we're talking 10 or 12 years.
Sure, and it is
10 or 12 years ago, everybody did not carry. 12 years ago, everybody did not carry around a cell phone.
Sure.
Today they do, and today the cell phones they carry around generally look fairly cool, and again become much more customized.
Well,
let alone being a tool themselves for self-expression by taking a photograph on your cell phone and posting it immediately onto your blog.
Yeah, it's a wild thing.
Yeah.
Well, I have a picture of I think it was taken around 1996, late 90s, of a friend of mine walking down the street talking on his cell phone. It looks like a scene out of a World War II movie. The cell phone is the closest thing you'd compare it to would be a walkie-talkie from World War II, one of those big, clunky, boxy things. It would be unrecognizable to my children. My children, who are 14 and under, would look at that and go, "What is he holding up to his ear?" Their first guess might be it's a microwave oven. It certainly bears no resemblance to a cell phone of the present. Okay, so that's abundance, which which leads to.
And abundance is important. And abundance, as I've said a couple of times, abundance does not get the airtime it deserves.
Well, we're trying to remedy that here at EconTalk and at my blog, Cafe Hayek. But yeah, go ahead. So that's abundance.
And then we also have Asia and automation. And here what I mean is, by Asia I mean essentially offshoring to places like India and Malaysia and the Philippines. And essentially what that has done is, and this idea of commoditization is really important. Essentially what has happened is that certain kinds of white-collar work has become commoditized. Today, any work that is routine, and that's really the devil word here, any work that's routine, where you can write down the steps and it has a right answer, where you can reduce it to a recipe or to a formula or to a series of instructions, that kind of work is just racing to wherever it can get done the cheapest. And that's certain kinds of white-collar work that our moms and dads told us to do. It's certain kinds of accounting. It's certain kinds of financial analysis. It's certain kinds of law even. And so if work is routine, it's a commodity. It is racing to places like India for now, but also eventually to places like the Philippines and Malaysia and some of the other Asian countries, to some extent even Eastern European countries. And to me, it's just a matter of simple math. If you think about it, if 15%, the numbers that I like to stack up are these three. If 15% of India's population, 15% of India's population hits the middle class, or hits sort of the upper middle class, talented, well-educated, able to compete in global labor markets, that's 150 million people. That's more than the population of Japan, world's second largest economy. It's more than the workforce in the U.S. That's 146 million people. And that's if 85% of India gets left behind. Then you have the fact that in a couple of years, India will be the largest English-speaking country in the world, and the fact that the cost of communication between North America and India is essentially zero. So, you add that all up, and it's clear that routine white-collar work is eventually going to race completely out of this country, and places like, England and the UK, England and Canada and Australia and Japan, and just go to the cheapest cost provider. And what that means is that increasingly, just as we had to make the migration from blue-collar work to white-collar work, we have to make the migration in this country from traditional routine white-collar work to much more creative, conceptual, empathic work, because that routine work is going to get done cheaper elsewhere. The other force, as you mentioned, is automation. And
Dan, let's stop. Let's stick with Asia for a minute, if we could.
Yeah.
Are you worried about that?
No.
Why not?
I mean, should I be?
Well, I'm asking you. You're the guest. Hey, buddy, watch yourself. Don't.
No, I'm not worried about. I am not worried about that because it's. I mean, for a whole host. What I'm worried about are two things. If I'm worried about anything at all, I'm worried about two things. First, I'm worried about the backlash that would stop it from happening, and I'm worried about being too cavalier about it and leaving people behind. But in general, this is how economies work. That is, if work can get done just as well, cheaper somewhere else, that's a good thing for everybody. It has dislocation effects in the short term, and the people who are dislocated and disadvantaged by that, need to have something in the form of assistance. But in general, I think it's a good thing. I mean, I think it's a good thing in the same way that routine blue-collar work doesn't get done in this country anymore. That liberated people to do other things, more interesting things, more creative things, more white-collar work, less back-breaking work.
So you don't think it threatens our standard of living? I know, it's a rhetorical question.
Well, it doesn't. No, it actually. I mean, again, I know that. I mean, it enhances our standard of living.
I quite agree.
I know that you agree, but I mean, that's why I'm laughing. I mean, it enhances our standard of living, and this is how economies grow. This is how nations prosper through that. I mean, this is there's a book called The Choice that tells this story in a lovely form about about the importance of comparative advantage, and it's the same thing with white collar work as it is with blue collar work. And it's going to have some dislocation, and I think that we haven't reckoned with that yet. I think we haven't said, how do we build an education system that allows people to flourish in this kind of world? How do we have the health, insurance, and pension systems that allow people to have some sense of security in this kind of world? So there are questions that it raises, but it's actually it enhances everybody's standard of living. The more this happens, the more that routine work gets done for less amount of money elsewhere. That frees up. That lowers the cost of goods and services, obviously, and it also frees up people to do more creative, interesting work. And this is something, sort of a lesson that I think societies and economies constantly have to relearn. There's in the book by one of Frank Levy and somebody else, and I'm forgetting the name, have a book that came out about 3 years ago, just after my book came out, maybe 2 years ago, just after my book came out, about the role of automation in labor markets. And forgive me, I cannot think of the name of the book.
We'll find it and put a link up to it.
Yeah,
Don't worry about
it's a very interesting book. And what it does, it tells a story at the beginning of this Blue Ribbon Commission that President Johnson convened in the mid-1960s, the smartest labor economists in America, to look out into the far-off year 2000 and say, what's the job situation going to be like then? And these, these smart people, the smartest economists in the country at that time, came back with this alarming report that said that by 2000, we're going to have massive unemployment. We're going to have widespread unemployment because these computers are going to be able to do all these jobs, and there's going to be nothing left for people to do.
Yeah.
And, of course, it's just flatly wrong because it underestimates ingenuity. It underestimates the dynamism in economies. It underestimates the capacity for people to come up with new things to do, new ways to earn a living. And I've seen this myself in sort of a slightly more kind of comical and personal way. I grew up in Ohio. At the time that the Rust Belt was rusting, and in the air is this notion that we're moving from an industrial economy to a service economy, and everyone has to make the transition. And to a lot of people, that seemed like utter BS including to my father, who I remember saying, my father's a smart guy, and he ended up saying, this is nonsense. Economies are about making things. They're not about services. We can't have an economy where everyone just runs around giving each other haircuts. That'll never work. And he didn't see search engine optimizers. He didn't see web designers. He didn't see massage therapists. He didn't see Starbucks. He didn't see designer toilet brushes. He didn't see mobile phone. No one did. And so this perspective that these kinds of transitions where people can do routine work cheaper is a threat is just wrong, because what it does is it unleashes creative capacity to enhance standard of living and do even better.
Yeah, it shows a remarkable lack of imagination for me when economists say that so many jobs are going to disappear. It's the part that's also forgotten that you're referring to is the fact that if we can do something much, much cheaper than we're doing it now, we're going to be better off. And they're going to be new things are going to be possible that we can't dream of, can't imagine. You told the story a few minutes ago about your grandparents showing up in middle-class America and what it would be like for them. You know, half of the things that they'd see, they wouldn't know what they were. You know, joking about my kids not knowing what a cell phone was of 1996. Certainly our grandparents wouldn't recognize any kind of cell phone, wouldn't recognize an iPod, wouldn't recognize the heart monitor, wouldn't recognize the antibiotics in the cabinet. It's just the list goes on. And none of those things were imagined in 1930. Well, some of them were, but most of them weren't. And to say that somehow we're going to run out of stuff to do, run out of stuff to be productive, when the ultimate resources are brains. What I like about your book, and let's get back to it now, what I like about your book is it imagines, it may not be accurate, but it imagines a set of paths. Well, it'd be remarkable if it were accurate. It may be somewhat accurate. It'd be a tremendous achievement. It imagines possible paths for how we can continue to use our brains in creative and innovative ways when some of the things that we're doing now aren't going to be as valued as they are today. So keep going. So we have outsourcing, which is going to take you call it Asia, but it's outsourcing to lower cost providers that are going.
Because outsourcing starts with O, and I needed to
exactly.
start with A.
Yeah, AOA could have been good too, though. But anyway, so this force of Asian lower costs is going to mean that a lot of things that we're doing now aren't going to be as valued and as productive as they are for Americans. So this is accounting, some types of accounting, some types of software design, some forms of medicine. Even we've got. I know we have stuff being X-rays that are being read overseas because it's cheaper to do it that way. So all kinds of things that used to be very lucrative in the United States aren't going to be lucrative anymore. But now there's going to be a whole bunch of stuff that's really cheap, which we're going to have all this other opportunity to do stuff with. Plus, some of the things that get done overseas can't be done here for all kinds of reasons that you talk about in the book. But so carry on.
So that's Asia, and then the third A is automation. And again, I mean, in some ways, as this conversation is alluding to, you know, we've seen this movie before too, and essentially what I'm talking about here is that last century. You have to look at it metaphorically. Last century, you had machines that replaced human backs, human muscle. That is, machines can do certain kinds of physical work better than human beings can. Take a forklift or you know, certain kinds of machine tools and so forth. Well, this century what's happening is that software is replacing our brain. But again, for now at least, software has a very difficult time replacing the artistic, empathic, inventive right brain side, the right side of the brain. But it ends up being very, very good at the routine, rule-based, sequential left side work. And this is why you see lawyers, certain kinds of legal work that you can go online to do, you know, for literally a tenth of the cost, things like online divorces. It's where you can get a piece of $14 software to ask you a series of questions about your will, and you still might go to a lawyer, but you go for 1 hour rather than 10 hours. You see a little bit of it, the early stages of it, in medical diagnosis, because medical diagnosis is about following decision trees, and software does that very well. And you know, you also see it in accounting. Think about personal accounting. you've got, it's sort of, again, another example of this misplaced emphasis. Last year, actually these are 2005 tax year, there were about 1 million U.S. tax returns done in India, and people went nuts about that. I mean, Lou Dobbs, went into coronary arrest every night about that. This is terrible for accounting jobs. Indian chartered accountants make $500, $600 a month. There's no way we can compete with that, blah, 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 blah. Meantime, no one says a word about TurboTax. You have 21 million Americans who did their taxes on TurboTax, a $39 piece of software.
Great point.
Rather than go to an accountant, because it's routine work that could get done cheaper. And so the bottom line here is that I think to make it today, the sorts of left-brain, white-collar, information age abilities just don't cut it. You have to be able to do work that's hard to outsource, hard to automate, and that delivers on a lot of these non-material values. And that ends up being, again, less of these routine left-brain, white-collar tasks and more of a set of abilities and capacities that we often haven't taken seriously enough in this country. Artistry, empathy, design, storytelling, contextual thinking, boundary-crossing thinking, to some extent even playfulness. Those kinds of abilities are now the ones that are really providing an economic edge.
You're listening to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty, and I'm talking with Dan Pink, author of A Whole New Mind. Dan, you suggest that there are 6 senses that we should try to enhance if we want to compete in this new world of age, automation, and abundance. Tell me what the 6 are, and then let's talk about a few of them.
Well, these are abilities that are hard, not impossible to outsource, hard, not impossible to automate, and that end up delivering on some of these, non-material values that are highly prized in an abundant age. So, and they are design. I'll just list them all: design, story, symphony, which is the ability to see the big picture, combine disparate things into something new, empathy, play, and meaning. And I think that if you look at businesses today that are working well, and if you look at individuals who are flourishing in their career, they tend to really be masters of these sorts of abilities. That these kinds of abilities, these hard to outsource, hard to automate abilities, are the ones that are giving people in organizations a real edge today.
Well, let's take the first one, which is design. We've talked about that already, how some of the products that are would otherwise be commodities are being enhanced with aesthetic features. One of the things I found interesting in the book is the explosion of design schools, are not just in the United States, but around the world. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, I think it's really an interesting phenomenon. I think, again, it's another really interesting hidden story about the rise of these art and design colleges as an economic force. If you look at where corporate recruiters are going, they're heading to places like the Rhode Island School of Design. They're heading to places like the Art Center College of Design. You have, General Motors recruiting there, and Procter & Gamble recruiting there, and some of these big schools. Electronic Arts, the game company, recruited last year 22 people from the senior class at the Rhode Island School of Art and Design, the Ringling School of Art and Design in Sarasota, Florida, one of the top design schools in the country. And this is at a class, they probably have 200-something people in the class. Electronic Arts came in and hired 22 of them because they had those kinds of abilities that are hard to outsource and hard to automate. And this is why I've endeared myself to business schools by declaring that the MFA is the new MBA.
Yeah, the MFA is the Masters of Fine Arts, right?
Masters of Fine Art. That ensures that I'll never get invited to a business school.
Well, there are worse fates. But the MFA is surprisingly successful right now. At least that's your claim. Is there any salary data to back that up, other than the anecdotal stories that they're being pursued by folks that are not normally who you'd associate with design?
I couldn't find much in the way of salary data, but if you look at some of the data on employment categories, you notice an uptick, more than an uptick. You notice a serious increase in jobs for art, entertainment, and design. That's the category that they use, to the point where there are more people working in those industries than there are working as accountants and auditors and whatever that sort of accounting category is. So I haven't seen it yet in the salary data. That's a little bit harder to come by. But in the job category data, you actually see substantial growth in that areas and modest growth in some of the more traditional white-collar areas.
And it's not just in the United States, right? It's happening worldwide.
Well, I mean, it's more in the United States because the United States actually has one of the great virtues of the United States is that it has a much more kind of flexible higher education system, and so you have a better developed infrastructure of art and design colleges here than anywhere in the world. Now, that said, there's no way that the United States has a permanent lock on art and design talent or capacity, not even close. And so, you do have art and design colleges sprouting in, actually Korea is an interesting example, but also in India and in China to some extent in Japan. I think one of the more interesting things going on is how much, say, traditional business schools are reaching across the aisle and trying to team up with these art and design colleges. So that they're doing, for instance, IIT in Chicago has a new program that's a combined business and design degree. You have places like INSEAD, the French business school, doing joint projects with the Art Center College of Design. You've got MIT and Harvard calling up the president of RISD trying to do joint projects. So you have a lot of this collaboration, this very whole-minded business plus design collaboration that's going on right now.
Well, I
business schools are recognizing that a lot of what they're teaching their kids are commodity skills.
We like to think of them as young adults, Dan, but
and then you also have Jeff Pfeffer at Stanford and others who are doing research saying that the MBA actually doesn't confer much in the way of additional earning effect. That basically it's 2 years of opportunity cost and some loans, and you don't really get it back.
Yeah.
And this is from a guy, tenured professor, obviously, at Stanford Business School. So you see business schools trying to reinvent their curriculum now. So, for instance, Yale Business School has done a radical revamp of its curriculum.
Well, what's funny about it to me is there are a lot of fads in business school curricula,
Sure.
and when you first raised the possibility that a business school would partner with design school, my first thought is, yeah, well, sure, because every business needs a logo, and you want right, you got to have some visual stuff. But what I think is profound here is that it's so much more than that. You're talking about the way the product is designed, the way it's marketed, that it should be done in an aesthetic manner, and it points really to the lessons of the book, which is that it'd be good for a person in business to have some aesthetic taste, not just
right. Well, and it also in some ways goes even beyond aesthetics in that designers think in a certain way. I mean, designers are problem solvers, and they think in a way that solves problems in ways that combine utility and significance, and they also are willing to see what's not there. They're willing to try to come up with something that the world didn't know it was missing. And design ends up being this very whole-minded skill that it isn't pure aesthetics. It isn't fine arts. It's a combination of that sort of soft-hearted aesthetic ability and a hard-headed, in some ways, an engineering sensibility. And another good business school example of this in North America is the Rotman School in Toronto, where the dean, Roger Martin, is saying, I mean, his words, not mine, business people today have to be designers. This is the head of a business school, and he has a program trying to revamp his curriculum around what's called integrative thinking, which is kind of combining this left brain approach and this right brain approach. And that goes back to something, Russ, that I said earlier about how, when I talk about the premium on these right brain abilities, I don't mean that these left brain abilities have no value at all. I mean, anytime I go to an art and design college, I say to these young men and women, do not run screaming from the room when the professor puts a number on the board. You have to be numerate. You're not going to be an effective designer. You're not going to be an effective, aesthetic worker if you're not numerate.
We talked earlier about the iPhone, which is Apple is a clear example of a firm that's used aesthetics and design as a way of enhancing its engineering capability, and how they're married if it's done well. You have the iPod is the supreme example. Their earlier attempt, the Newton, for a palm-based device was not so successful for a variety of reasons.
Because it didn't work.
I think one, yeah. But I think one of the
that's a great example. I hadn't even thought of that. I mean, in some ways, it got the aesthetics and significance right, but it didn't have the utility.
Right. The Palm was really the next the first really successful one.
Yeah, because it worked.
And it was.
I remember Doonesbury used to did like 3 months of cartoons about how bad the handwriting recognition system was on the Newton.
Yeah, and then on the flip side, you've got the ability on the new iPhone, at least in theory, to use your finger to flick through your album collection visually. And when I see that, I think that looks fun. It's not that useful. It's probably just as good to scroll down a list of type, but it looks fun visually. But I want to raise a question. I want to move on, but I want to ask a question along the way. You talk about the Rotman School. Is that the name in Toronto?
Yes, Rotman, R-O-T-M-A-N. Yeah.
That's trying to take a more integrative approach.
Right.
One of the challenges of that, and this is a challenge I think for everybody who is inspired by your book, and there are a lot of inspiring things in the book. There are a lot of practical pieces of advice on how to enhance your skill set in these different areas, which I think is a really nice feature. But one of the challenges is some of these things, although they are important, and I agree with you that they're important, they're very hard to teach, some of them.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll get, as we go along, to some of the others, I'll mention some of my skepticism about or at least some of the challenges that people are going to face trying to do these more enhanced marriage of the left and the right brain. But the design thing is clearly important. Let's move to story. What do you mean by story?
Well, by story, I mean let's take a step back and talk about why it's necessary in business. It's necessary in business because facts have less value. I mean, it used to be that there was a premium and advantage attached to being able to find a fact, but now, anybody essentially can find with internet access can find a fact that they need in 10 seconds, and what that means is that what matters more than facts themselves are putting facts in context and delivering them with emotional impact, and that's what a story does. So you now see story, which we often kind of ghettoize as something not serious, even deceitful. You now see story moving into a lot of realms of business, whether it's leadership or whether it's knowledge management, and certainly into, I think, very profoundly into differentiation in a crowded marketplace.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important trend that's you're one of the first to notice. I noticed it when I noticed how many commercials tell stories rather than sell product. Sometimes the product's just totally in the background. It's just a clever, entertaining story to try to grab your attention, move you, get you to remember it. And of course, I write novels trying to teach economics because I think they're more interesting and more memorable. I think it's a crucial part of learning is via storytelling and hearing stories.
Absolutely. It's a crucial part of being a human being. I mean, I think that's one of the things that has been lost in the banishment, in many ways, of story from the business realm. I mean, this is how human beings communicate. I mean, when you come home from a long day and your spouse says, how was your day? You don't whip out a PowerPoint presentation, with 13 bullets and a pie chart. I mean, you narrate. You say, oh, my God, first this happened and that happened. This is how human beings are wired. I mean, literally in their brains, to see the world as a series of episodes, not necessarily as a series of logical propositions. And so I think that that bringing story back into business is actually more in sync with how human beings actually operate, and that's why it's more effective. And
while we're doing this over the airwaves as a radio-like experience, visual storytelling, I think, is increasingly important for all kinds of reasons. In my last issue of Wired, it came with a DVD called Eureka, and it was an ad. It was a commercial. Uh-huh. It wasn't a full-page ad in the magazine. It was a DVD, and the DVD, I didn't know what it was. I popped it. I usually throw them out, but I happened to pop it into my DVD player, and it was an ad for Shell Oil, and it was about Shell's challenges in trying to find new sources of petroleum, crude oil, dealing with the economics and the environment. But instead of making it, as you say, like a PowerPoint presentation, it was filmed as a serious Hollywood-style movie It was 10 minutes long. It must have cost, I assume, a million plus, maybe $2-3 million to film it with this level of cinematic quality. And it was a story. It wasn't just a high quality visual ad. And here we are talking about it, which I guess was
right. That's what I was going to say.
That's part of the goal, but it was much more than that. Much more than the novelty of it. It tried to pluck at your heartstrings in a left brain and right brain way. It tried to make it clear. I didn't say that very well, but it tried to make it clear that it's hard to find oil and it's expensive. That's the left brain part. But the right brain part was that the guy looking for the oil is a decent human being. He's a good guy. He's not a monster. He's got troubles with his kid. They're struggling. And actually they use the kid's conversation with the dad who's kind of ashamed. The kid's kind of ashamed the dad's, an environmental monster. And the dad, lets the dad say, yeah, well, you like your product, the things in your life that are used oil, don't you? Oh, yeah, I guess so. So it's a piece of propaganda. It's a piece of propaganda, but it's packaged in a way to make it more compelling and more memorable.
And I think their point about visual storytelling is actually quite important. I mean, as you know, I've spent the last 2 months in Japan, and what was I studying? I was studying manga, which is Japanese comics, which are an incredibly popular, incredibly persuasive, incredibly valuable form of visual storytelling that's at the heart of Japanese pop culture, and that is increasingly spreading all over the world because it combines both text and image, because it's very whole-minded, and because it can be a more compelling form of presentation.
That's a cool thing. Anything else you want to say about story?
No.
Well, I'm going to add one thing. I think communication just by itself is undervalued. I find it remarkable that students brag to me over the years how they took this course or that because, quote, you don't have to write a paper. When I used to teach in a business school, a lot of the business school students would tell me that was one of the best things about being a business major is that you don't have to write any papers. And I thought, boy, what an error of judgment. So if there are any young listeners out there listening, Dan Pink, author of Free Agent Nation, along with the book we're talking about, A Whole New Mind. Dan, you're a free agent. You've severed the bonds of, quote, normal or real employment, as you sometimes call it. But the reason you were able to do that is because you're smart, obviously. You can think of some interesting things to say, but you say them well. And saying things well is an incredibly valued skill that is, I think, often forgotten.
Yeah, actually, one reason I was able to go out on my own is that my wife had a job and she had health insurance. That helped.
Hey.
But I also think saying something is important, and I think that in a lot of business is not so much that it's. I don't put a huge amount of credence in this idea that there's kind of substance and style in communication. I think the two are inextricably linked, and I think one of the reasons that certain kinds of business communication sounds like nonsense is not because of inartful presentation or execution, but because people aren't saying anything.
Yeah, that's a problem. That is a problem.
I think that's really at the core of it. And I think one reason for that, though, in people's defense, is that there's this kind of false sense of there's a kind of false sense of what it is to sound like a business person, that there's certain ways that you talk to be taken seriously, and they tend to be completely room-emptying kinds of ways that people think signify seriousness, but in fact signify that you don't know what the hell you're talking about.
I couldn't agree with you more. In my area, in academic life, I always like it when someone says about a professor, well, he really knows his stuff, but he just can't. And I'm thinking, maybe he doesn't really know his stuff. Sometimes,
exactly.
A lot of times, there's a certain mystique about a bad communicator. He must be a genius. Maybe he's just doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yes, and that is, if you could puncture that myth, you'd be doing something very valuable for the world.
Yeah, we can both work on it.
But I think that's it's sort of the emperor. It's the emperor has no clothes.
Absolutely.
It's like the reason this guy, it's not that this guy's a bad communicator. It's what this guy has to say isn't important, isn't interesting, or, God forbid, isn't right.
Or he doesn't fully understand it. He doesn't understand
it himself.
He doesn't
right.
understand it well enough to communicate it. I think that's one of the great lessons of life is that if you understand something, you should be able to communicate. It might be dry, it might be boring, but you should be able to at least get it across. The people who are so opaque and so mysterious that you can't figure out what they're saying, I always the default should be that they don't know what they're talking about. Although Hegel supposedly used to deliberately make his class lectures confusing and go home and laugh at his students because he had deliberately made them meaningless. But I slander.
And look where it got him.
I slander my profession. Let's turn to symphony, which I think is an incredibly important thing.
But by symphony I mean seeing the big picture, teasing out the meaningful currents from the welter of information out there, and also combining two things into something new. And what this is in some ways is an argument. Not entirely, but it's a little bit of an argument against pure specialization, particularly in work. If you think about especially the technical fields, anything, let's say in college, anything you learn in a technical field in college as a freshman is probably going to become obsolete by the time you're a senior. And so what matters more is seeing the big picture, learning how to learn, being curious, and those kinds of things. And so there's a fair amount of evidence out there, a little bit of evidence in some of the psychological studies that show that big picture thinking is probably the best predictor of star performance in the workplace. And also I think that there are many more returns to multiness than there are to pure, deep, momentary specialization. And you see this especially in terms of hiring in business. There's a premium on people who are multidisciplinary, multifunctional, multicultural, multilingual, people who can move smoothly across boundaries, who can understand how the pieces fit together, who can operate in different realms. And that's what I mean by symphony. And also symphony is at the heart of another aspect of symphony, that is taking something from two realms and combining it into something the world didn't know it was missing, is really at the heart of invention. And again, that capacity to constantly invent, come up with something new, there's always been a premium on that, but there's even a higher premium now when people have so many of their particular needs and wants already satisfied and oversatisfied.
Well, I agree with you that the star is often the big picture thinker. I think the best leaders in business, whether they're mavericks or whether they're in the mainstream, the best thinkers are those who synthesize, those who integrate. But it's a rare skill. Part of the reason those are the stars is that ability is so scarce. So again, I wonder about the practicality of it, how much you can personally enhance your own ability to do that. And I would suspect that for many people, that deep specialization remains the way to go, although it is riskier now than it was.
I'm not so sure about that. I think that it's partly, I think all of these abilities, I think for a lot of these abilities, it's like any other attribute of the human condition, is partly in your DNA. But like all these things, there's a range. And so if you think about height, I mean, your DNA is going to tell you pretty much what your height is going to be right when you're born, and your environment is going to determine, at what end of the range it's going to be. But there's a relatively narrow band. I think for these, there is a band, if you think about something like empathy, or if you think about something like this symphonic capacity. But I actually think it's a pretty wide band, and you can move people to the upper realm of their band. I think one reason why people are not as good at symphony, at seeing how the pieces fit together, is that, especially in formal education, they have operated in a world that doesn't help them see how the pieces fit together.
Well,
they march from math class and a bell rings, when a bell rings, and then they march to science class and a bell rings, and then they march to English class and the bell rings, and no one ever says these things have anything in common.
And after sixth grade, they don't march to, or maybe fourth grade, they don't march to art class anymore even, so they don't even...
That's a big part of it, and also they avoid writing. They, as you said in the business schools, they avoid writing. They don't think that writing is anything you do if you're a mathematician or if you're a scientist, and so they don't see how the pieces fit together. One little datum that I think is quite interesting from the National Center for Education Statistics is the increasing number, I think it's basically a 4x increase over the last 20 years or so, in self-designed college majors, because the traditional categories, academic categories, don't map the world as well as students want. So they recognize that, let's say they want to go into biology. Well, a lot of biology issues today raise ethical questions. So maybe they want to combine biology and philosophy, and maybe they want to do something in bioethics. And so you have this really interesting increase in the number of these boundary-crossing self-designed majors, because the categories that people are cabinet into don't make that much sense, and people are recognizing that all these things are linked up, that they're not as segmented as we would have them believe.
Yeah.
So I think I really do think that is a big barrier. That I think if you're steeped in that kind of environment where no one ever bothers to point out the connections to you, then it's not surprising that after 12 years of formal education, you're not thinking that symphonically.
Well, I like that point. I think the educational system is remarkably uninnovative, partly because it's run like a government monopoly, and maybe for other reasons, though. And let me suggest some of those other reasons and get your reaction. We talked earlier about fads in business schools. One of the fads that I've watched over the years is the appeal of the interdisciplinary approach. A lot of schools, business schools, sell to their prospective students that they're interdisciplinary, but I know in reality they're not. It's a bit of a sham and a bit of a fraud. And the reason it's not, the reason those promises are usually not true, although, as you say, students have a hunger for it, and often at the undergraduate level are going to do more integrative stuff, it rarely works out at an MBA level because the professors are not interdisciplinary. They are the result of a highly intense, narrow, deep specialization. They're not just accountants. They're one kind of accountant and one kind of thing. And at the med school level, in medical school, you don't just have pediatricians. You don't just have pediatric oncologists. You have pediatric oncologists who specialize in one type of cancer, which is a wonderful thing at a certain point, because it allows that extraordinary power of specialization that we've left out of the equation in most of our conversation today, and we've talked about it elsewhere in other podcasts. But specialization is very powerful, but as you point out, it's limiting, and yet the challenge to unleash those limits, to break those limits, is that the people who are doing the instructing are the product of the system that was very narrow, and the people, the ability of the average instructor to cut across, say, accounting, finance, economics, and marketing, or better accounting, economics, finance, marketing, and aesthetics, and ethics and philosophy. Those folks are hard to come by, and most of them who are doing it are kind of faking it. What you can get sometimes is team teaching, so you can watch two people brush up against each other in their specialties. That's one way to do it. But I think the biggest challenge of this kind of approach is the practicality of it. Although I do think it's a glorious thing when you can look at something in a new way, when you can bring two things together. The better way to say this maybe is just the cliche of thinking outside the box. Most people are in the box. That's just by definition. That's what's normal. The ability of people to cut across disciplines and see things in a new way it's a scarce skill.
Yeah, although I think that the scarcity comes. I really do think that a lot of the scarcity comes from the context in which people operate, rather than some kind of intrinsic, inherent limitation on their abilities.
Maybe. Why? What are you thinking? What's your...
Well, no. What I'm thinking is that if you think about a little kid doesn't see the world cabined into these categories. That an adult would. And I really think a lot of it has to do with the way that cabining is inculcated in people in their formal education. And I think if a different kind of formal education, people would be seeing more broadly. To me, a lot of these abilities, and I mentioned this in the book, a lot of these abilities to me remind me of literacy and numeracy. That is, we tend to think that most people, the vast majority of people can be literate, and the vast majority of people can be numerate. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone who's numerate is going to be a great mathematician, or everyone who's literate is going to be, a Nobelist novelist. But it does mean that people can become literate and numerate and be able to express themselves in words, be able to read, be able to write effectively. It also means that people will have a grasp of the basic numerical concept, will be able to think in a, in a numerate way. And I think it's the same thing with symphony and all these other abilities. That is that with the proper settings, the proper context, the proper environments. And I don't mean necessarily, I'm avoiding using the word teaching, instruction, training, but in the proper setting, environment, situations, that these abilities can become like literacy and numeracy, things that people can master reasonably well.
Well, let me agree with you in the following way. I think it's a market opportunity for universities. And the way that they meet the market opportunity now, the way we meet it at George Mason and at other universities or in the business schools that I've been talking about, is we create these interdisciplinary majors, and that means you can take courses in different areas. So you can move among the boxes, but you don't really – the task of moving across the boxes is sort of left up to you. And occasionally you get what's called a capstone course or a synthesis course, and some of those are good, probably many of them are not. So I think there's – and I do – to come back to my earlier point – I think the thing that makes that hard to do is the instructors. I think it's very hard to find truly interdisciplinary people, but obviously they are at a premium and can provide a lot of value. Is really what you're saying.
Yeah, and there are other ways to do it too. I mean, I know that my alma mater, Northwestern University, was experimenting or proposing. I don't think they've actually instituted it. A senior thesis project that involved your doing a collaboration with someone outside of your major. So you would do your senior thesis as a joint project with somebody else, and let's say you were an economics major, and you would do a joint senior project with someone who, say, was an anthropology major. And you guys would come up with a joint question to answer and pursue it together and pursue it across disciplines. And I think that, that's a fascinating approach.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. The other thing I think you're right about, which I'm not quite sure where this is going to end up, but, when I think about homeschooling, which I've thought about, our kids are not homeschooled, but when I think about homeschooling, one of the things you think about is the opportunity for interdisciplinary synthesizing whole brain kind of education outside the different bell ring, something different than the bell rings you move from class to class. And it'd be interesting to see if homeschooled kids are better at interdisciplinary activity and synthesizing and bringing things together. Because I think because they're outside the box of the public school system, and most private schools have the same problem. Maybe they learn some different skills.
I think they do. I mean, actually, in my first book, Free Nation, I wrote about homeschooling, and I've written a little bit about it and talked to a lot of homeschoolers. And there's basically two different categories of homeschoolers. There are people who are homeschooling often for kind of cultural reasons, and a lot of them end up, in some ways, recreating the traditional academic environment or the traditional academic approach, particularly the approach to categories and subjects. You also have an approach in homeschooling called unschooling that is very much about this, which is about letting the kid follow his or her own interests and move smooth, and not even have these boundaries to move smoothly across. Basically, letting the kid, say, "Hey, I'm really interested in dragons," or "I'm really interested in martial arts," or "I'm really interested in baseball," and pursuing that and recognizing if you study baseball, for instance, well, you're going to learn some physics in how the ball moves. You're going to learn some history about where baseball came from and about American history. You're going to learn literature because there are all these great novels and things written about this. And so my hunch would be they are.
You're going to be very numerate also, because you're going to learn a lot of statistics and hypotheses and how to test data.
Well, I got to tell you, Russ, I mean, the reason I'm numerate is because I was a baseball fan as a kid. I'm absolutely convinced that it had much more to do with being a baseball fan, reading box scores, and playing Stratomatic baseball than it did with any formal mathematics education I got in school.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that Stratomatic baseball is clearly a key predictor of economic success in the 21st century, but I think we'll want to devote an entire podcast to that another time.
But now people don't even do that anymore so much, as there are all these other kinds of, these fantasy. I didn't have fantasy leagues when I was a kid. They didn't have these. You read about these simulation leagues?
No.
Where you basically you draft a team and the computer simulates with a set of rules about how you want to manage it, and then in the space of like a week, the computer simulates a series of a season's worth of games.
It's just Stratomatic. It's Stratomatic for the 21st century.
Right. It's basically Stratomatic on speed without the dice, and without what it lacks is it basically turns the managerial decisions into an algorithm rather than a case by case decision.
Yeah, but that's very cool.
Yeah, it's cool and it's fast.
But anyway, I think going back to the substance, although I'd love to talk about baseball, but I think it's clear that homeschooling has the potential to break down some of the traditional paradigms for education, and it'll be interesting to see how that turns out as it occurs.
There are a lot of lessons in homeschooling for the traditional education system. My kids are not homeschooled either, but there are a lot of lessons in homeschooling that both public and private schools would do well to heed. Yeah, it's
interesting. And we still have a lot more to learn about the brain and how we learn and how we use the stuff we learn. Let me challenge you we're almost out of time. Let me challenge you with the last question. Mm-hmm. You talk in the book about going through a course in learning how to draw. Mm-hmm. And I worked through that same course. I didn't take it on site, but I worked through the exercises in Betty Edwards' book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. Is it Betty or Betsy? Betty. So that's an amazing book, and what I loved about it, which you chronicle in your book in a painful and embarrassing way, I have to say, Dan, is what a horrible artist you were when you started, as was I, and that a person who is, quote, talent-free, as I thought I was, and I think I am, can actually learn how to draw. I can't take a blank piece of paper and draw a horse. It still looks like a 6-year-old drawing a horse. Right. But I can look at a horse and I can make a horse after I look at it, and and it's deeply gratifying. And for a long time, and maybe a little bit still, it changed the way that I looked at the world around me. And I think that was a glorious part of being a human being. And I think I joked earlier, because I know you talk about it in the book, the fact that after you turn a certain age, if you're not good at art, they don't let you do it anymore in school. It's considered a, quote, waste of time. And I think that's a tragedy. I think that's a shame. I think it's a part of being a whole person. But I wonder if it's anything more than that, and that's what I'd like to hear you defend. I think doing that's made me a better father, that it's made me a better seer of the world around me. It's enhanced my walks at dusk when I see how the light plays off the trees. I love all that. But you're making a much stronger claim in the book that kind of thing, and you talk about play and meaning, topics we didn't get to, but you claim it's going to make me a more productive person, not just a better, fuller person. Do you want to try to defend that as our closing thought?
Well, first, let me sort of take issue with the divide that's implicit in the question. I actually think that being a happier, more fulfilled, more insightful person makes you a more productive person. That having a sense of who you are, what your place is in the world, how the world operates, actually makes you more productive in and of itself. For me, though, that course was valuable not so much in my ability to draw, but as you were saying, Russ, in my ability to see. I see the world differently after taking that drawing course. Example, I didn't know what a negative space was. Now I see negative spaces everywhere. I think noticing light and shadow is effective in widening one's eye to how the world operates and how the pieces fit together. I think it enhances one's design sensibility. I think it gives you a better sense of proportions and relationships in the world. And that now, is there a direct payoff? That is, if you take a drawing course, will your what is going to be the increase in the present value of your lifetime income? I don't know if you can make that kind of connection. But I think inevitably that being able to see, being able to understand how the pieces fit together, being able to see what's not there, enhances your ability to come up with new ideas, enhances your ability to combine ideas into something new, enhances your ability to, in this case metaphorically, see the big picture, makes you a fuller human being, and therefore makes you productive. I mean, although I'll grant you that you can't necessarily prove a direct causal relationship between taking an art class and boosting one's earnings. But I think it's actually a pretty reasonable leap of faith for a lot of people that if they enhance those kinds of abilities, they're going to have a better life. But I also think they're going to have a life that's better off as well.
Well, I like that, and I think you probably make the same point about calculus. Taking calculus is probably a good idea. I encourage my children to do it. I think it's part of being a full human being, and it probably makes you more productive, although in most cases it'd certainly be hard to measure.
Sure. I mean, because it gives you it's a form of thinking. I mean, it's a way of thinking. It's another way to understand the world. And the more of these arrows of understanding you have in your quiver, the more you're going to be able to understand the world. The more you're going to be able to see it in a different way. And so again, that's why mathematical thinking, literary thinking, design thinking, aesthetic thinking, engineering thinking, all these different approaches are valuable. And if you can master them in some degree, it's really, I think, a case where 1 + 1 + 1 is well more than 3.
My guest today has been Dan Pink, contributing editor at Wired and author of A Whole New Mind. Dan, thanks for being part of the conversation at EconTalk.
Thanks for having me. It's been a delight.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.